Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
On November 9th, 1989, the world watched in joy and disbelief the fall of a barrier that had separated the communist East and the democratic West Germany for close to 3 decades. Its fall symbolized the end of the Cold War that had almost brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Behind this historic event stood two great leaders with contrasting ideologies and diverse leadership styles, but with a mutual vision for world peace. Tearing down the wall, how Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev ended the Cold War. The 1960s and the 1970s saw many crises in America, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the tragedy of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and the Iran hostage crisis, which resulted in a sense of low morale and declining military capability. At this moment of America's greatest doubts, stepped in Ronald Reagan as the 40th President of the United States. An actor-turned politician, Reagan took office promising to revitalize the economy and rebuild military capability. At about the same time, in far-off Soviet Union, a young law graduate was rising through the ranks of the Provincial Communist Party. Mikhail Gorbachev, acclaimed as a regional reformer, was appointed to the Agricultural Central Committee in 1978 and was soon promoted to become the youngest member of the Politburo in 1980. The post-World War II global politics had been dominated by the Cold War, leading to a tense political climate. Previous presidents had adopted a policy of containment towards the Cold War to achieve détente, a peaceful if uneasy coexistence. This policy led to the signing of several treaties, including the SALT treaties and the Helsinki Accords, but a lasting peace still remained elusive. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis amply demonstrated, nuclear war was just a button away. But in Reagan, the U.S. found a leader whose approach to the Cold War was radically different. Reagan was never convinced of the policies of containment and détente in ending the Cold War.
SALT II is not strategic arms limitation. It is a strategic arms buildup with the Soviet Union authorized to add a minimum of 3,000 nuclear warheads to their already massive inventory.
Instead of détente, his road to peace was through strength. By building America's economic and military power, he aimed to not merely contain Soviet communism, the evil empire, but to defeat and dismantle it.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
Towards this, Reagan put his unshakable faith in America's free enterprise system. He knew that the vast, bureaucratic, centrally planned Soviet economy was no match for America's capitalist system. His strategy involved starting a rapid, large increase in the quantity and quality of America's military technology and weapons and dare the Soviets to match it. Only 2 years into his presidency, Reagan increased the military budget to $521 billion to modernize and augment U.S. warheads and delivery systems. This trend of increased military spending would continue throughout his presidency.
President Reagan's decision to build up our military was having a huge impact on the then Soviet Union, because they didn't have the resources to keep up with America. That was President Reagan's view. People tried to knock him off of it. And he said, no, if we build up, nobody's going to compete with us, including the Soviet Union.
Americans and many Europeans viewed President Reagan as a warmonger.
Honey, you're not dressed up scary for Halloween.
Nance, if John F. Kennedy were alive today, he'd be younger than I am. I'm 75 years old, and I've got my finger on the button. I just couldn't think of anything more scary than that. Trick or treat, fellas.
But in reality, Reagan abhorred nuclear weapons and wanted to bring the Soviets to the bargaining table. In 1983, Reagan proposed another tactical response to the Cold War, the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative, soon dubbed the Star Wars program. This was an ambitious project to construct a space-based anti-missile system that neutralized the premise of mutually assured destruction on which the Cold War politics had rested until then. The Soviets opposed the Star Wars program as it upset the existing Cold War stalemate and may lead to war in space. Although grave doubts still remained regarding the viability of the technology, the strategy was enough to make the Soviet leaders sufficiently worried. After the death of a series of geriatric Soviet leaders, Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, marking a turning point in the Cold War. Youthful, vigorous, charismatic, and media-savvy, Gorbachev brought a new face to Soviet leadership. He could also be a ruthless politician, described by some as a man with a nice smile but iron teeth. When he came to power, the Soviet Union was riddled with economic stagnation, food shortages, political problems, and an escalating Cold War.
Because he was so personable and persuasive, and he was very eloquent. He spoke very well. He was able to persuade a lot of people. So when he came to Moscow, he was struck by how corrupt and slow and inefficient the system was. And he realized we had to change that. We had to reform that system.
Gorbachev introduced a policy of glasnost or openness, encouraging freedom of speech and expression, and perestroika, or restructuring. With these political reforms, he started to slowly transform the Stalinist Soviet regime into a more modern social democracy. When faced with opposition to his domestic reforms, Gorbachev, showing his ruthless leadership style, removed the communist hardliners from their positions. As Gorbachev introduced more domestic reforms, Reagan started developing trust in the new Soviet leadership.
Gorbachev, in the beginning, was a persuaded communist. He wanted communism with a human face, but still communism. And Reagan, of course, believed in democracy and thought that communism was wrong.
A series of unprecedented exchanges of letters between the two leaders thawed the relations further and set the stage for the first summit in Geneva in November 1985. Although no agreements were reached at the summit, both leaders came to appreciate each other's role in this peace endeavor. Reagan sensed Gorbachev's sincerity in reducing arms on the basis of equal security, while Gorbachev understood that Reagan's intentions were rooted in his deepest abhorrence for the nuclear war.
As they got to know each other, they became not friendly, but instead of being enemies, they were trusting adversaries.
When Gorbachev showed up for their very first summit and got out of his limousine at the bottom of the steps, Reagan was waiting at the top of the steps, and it was a cold day in Geneva, but Reagan had no hat on and no coat on, so Reagan looked stronger, tougher, on top of his game. So Reagan paid attention to these theatrical forms of leadership.
The warmth and personal chemistry that was generated in Geneva did not, however, lead to any quick agreement on nuclear arms reductions. In October 1986, an impatient Gorbachev proposed a hastily arranged summit at Reykjavik, which would turn out to be one of the most dramatic of all time. For the first time in history, the idea of completely eliminating nuclear weapons was visited, but the sticking point of SDI remained. Reagan would disagree with Gorbachev's demands that the SDI should be confined to the laboratory. Although the leaders failed to come to an agreement and left disappointed, the trust between them had grown, leading to future successes.
Reagan's leadership was most important within his own party because he insisted that we should negotiate an end to the Cold War, and it was even harder for Gorbachev because he had to take a system that was locked into many policies that were not even in the Soviet interest and turn it around.
Just 1 year after Reykjavik, Gorbachev arrived in Washington to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, for the first time eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty followed this a few years later.
Remember that it was not the victory of one side over the other, but a mutual victory over a very dangerous and bad policy.
The election of a democratic government in Poland in 1989 marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The world anxiously expected the Soviet Union to react, but Gorbachev showed restraint and refused to act. The thirst for democracy and freedom soon spread to the rest of Eastern Europe, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and culminating in the dramatic breakup of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. The end of the Cold War has resulted in an increased sense of security for people around the world, as the threat of a nuclear war is now severely diminished. It has also meant that countries around the world can now spend less on military budgets and spend the so-called peace dividend on education, health, and other welfare programs to improve the quality of life for all. For this, we thank the courage of two leaders whose vision helped end the Cold War. Not with a bang, nor with a whimper, but with a handshake.